Good evening. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. All right, we are going to pick back up in our book reading from Maria Monk, Awful Disclosures, Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed. We are in chapter 18. Chapter 18, The Punishment of the Cat. The priests of the District of Montreal have free access to Black Nunnery. Crimes committed and required by them. Pope's command to commit indecent crimes, characters of the old and new superiors, timidity of the latter. I began to be employed in the hospitals, some account of them, warning given to me by a sick nun, penance of hanging. This punishment was occasionally resorted to for very trifling offences, such as washing the hands without permission, and it was generally applied on the spot and before the other nuns in community rooms. I have mentioned before that the country, so far down as the Three Rivers, is furnished with priests by the Seminary of Montreal, and that these 150 men are liable to be occasionally transferred from one station to another. Numbers of them are often to be seen in the streets of Montreal, as they may find a home in the seminary. They are considered as having an equal right to enter the Black Nunnery whenever they please, and then, according to our oaths, they have complete control over the nuns. To name all works of shame of which they are guilty in that retreat would require much time and space. Neither would be necessary to the accomplishment of my object, which is the publication of some of their criminality to the world, and the development, in general terms, of scenes thus far carried on in secret within the walls of that convent where I was so long an inmate. Secure against detection by the world, they never believed that an eyewitness would ever escape to tell of their crimes and declare some of their names before the world. But the time has come. Some of their deeds of darkness must come to the day. I have seen in the nunnery priests from more, I presume, than 100 country places admitted for shameful and criminal purposes, from St. Charles, St. Denis, St. Mark's, St. Antoine, Chambly, Verderer, St. John's, etc. How unexpected to them will be the disclosure I make. Shut up in a place from which there has been thought to be put one way of egress, and that the passage to the grave they consider themselves safe in perpetuating crimes in our presence, and in making us share in their criminality as often as they chose, conducted more shamelessly than even the brutes. These debauchees would come in without ceremony, concealing their names both by night and day, being within the walls of that prison house of death, where the cries and pains of the injured innocence of their victims would never reach the world, for relief or redress for their wrongs, without remorse or shame. They would glory not only in sating their brutal passions, but even in torturing the most barbarous manner feelings of those under their power, telling us at the same time that this mortifying the flesh was religion and pleasing to God. The more they could torture us or make us violate our own feelings, the more pleasure they took in their unclean reveling, and all their brutal obscenity they called meritorious before God. We were sometimes invited to put ourselves to voluntary sufferings in a variety of ways, not for a penance, but to show our devotion to God. A priest sometimes say to us, "Now, which of you has love enough for Jesus to stick a pin through their cheeks?" Some of us would signify our readiness and immediately thrust one through the head. Sometimes he would propose that we would repeat the operation several times on the spot, and the cheeks of a number of nuns would be bloody. There were other acts occasionally proposed and consented to, which I cannot name in a book. Such the superior would sometimes command us to perform, many of them things not only useless and unheard of, loathsome and indecent in the highest possible degree. How they ever could have been invented, I never could conceive. Things were done worse than the entire exposure of the person, though this was occasionally required of several at once in the presence of the priest. The superior of the seminary would sometimes come and inform us that she had received orders from the Pope to request that those nuns who possessed the greatest devotion and faith should be requested to perform some particular deeds which she named or described in our presence, but of which no decent or moral person could ever venture to speak. I cannot repeat what would injure any ear, nor debase to the lowest possible degree. I am bound by a regard to truth, however, to confess that deluded women were found among us who would comply with their request. There was a great difference between the character of our old and new superiors, which soon became obvious. The former used to say she liked to walk because it would prevent her from becoming corpulent. She was therefore very active and constantly going about from one part of the nunnery to another, overseeing us at our various employments. Never saw her in any appearance of timidity. She seems, on the contrary, bold and masculine, and sometimes much more than that, cruel and cold-blooded in scenes calculated to overcome any common person. Such a character had particularly exhibited at the murder of St. Francis. The new superior, on the other hand, was so heavy and lame that she walked with much difficulty, and consequently exercised a less vigilant oversight of the nuns. She was also of a timid disposition, or else had been overcome by some great fright in her past life, for she was apt to become alarmed in the night, never liked to be alone in the dark. She had long performed the part of an old nun, which is that of a spy upon the younger ones, and was well known to us in that character under the name of Saint Marguerite. Soon after her promotion to the station of superior, she appointed me to sleep in her apartment, and then assigned me a sofa to lie upon. One night, while I was asleep, she suddenly threw herself upon me, exclaimed in great alarm, "Oh, my Dieu! Oh, my Dieu!" That means, "Oh, my God! Oh, my God! What is that?" I jumped up and looked about the room, but saw nothing, and endeavored to convince her that there was nothing extraordinary there. But she insisted a ghost had come and held her bed curtain so that she could not draw it. I examined it and found that the curtain had been caught by a pin in the valance which had held it back, but it was impossible to tranquilize her for some time. She insisted on me sleeping with her the rest of the night. I stretched myself across the foot of her bed and slept there till morning. During the last part of my stay in the convent, I was often employed in attending in the hospitals. There are, as I have been before mentioned, several apartments devoted to the sick, and there is a physician of Montreal who attends as physician to the convent. It must not be supposed, however, that he knows anything concerning the private hospitals. It is a fact of great importance to be distinctly understood and constantly borne in mind that he is never, under any circumstances, admitted into the private hospital rooms. Of these he sees nothing more than any stranger whatever. He is limited to the care of those patients who are admitted from the city into the public hospitals and one of the nuns' hospitals, and these he visits every day. Sick, poor, are received for charity by the institution, attended by some of the nuns, and often go away with the highest ideas of our charitable characters and holy lives. The physician himself might perhaps in some cases share in the delusion. I frequently followed Dr. Nelson to the public hospital at the direction of the superior, with pen, ink, and paper in my hands, and wrote down the prescriptions which he ordered for the different patients. These were afterwards prepared and administered by the attendants. About a year before I left the convent, I was first appointed to attend the private sick rooms, and was frequently employed in that duty up to the day of my departure. Of course, I had opportunities to observe the number and classes of patients treated there, and in what I am to say on the subjects, I appeal with perfect confidence to any true and competent witness to confirm my words, whenever such a witness may appear. It would be vain for anybody who has merely visited the convent from curiosity, or resided in as a novice, to question my declarations. Such a person must necessarily be ignorant of even the existence of the private rooms, unless informed by someone else. Such rooms, however, there are, and I could relate many things which have passed there during the hours I was employed in them, as I have stated. One night I was called to sit up with an old nun named Saint Clare, who, in going downstairs, had dislocated a limb, and lay in a sick room adjoining the hospital. She seemed to be a little out of her head a part of the time, but appeared to be quite in possession of her reason most of the night. It was easy to pretend that she was delirious, but I considered her as speaking the truth, though I felt reluctant to repeat what I heard her say, and excused myself from mentioning it even at confession, on the ground that the superior thought her deranged. What led her to some of the most remarkable parts of her conversation was a motion I made in the course of the night to take the light out of her little room into the adjoining apartment, to look once more at the sick persons there. She begged me not to leave her room a moment in the dark, for she could not bear it. I have witnessed so many horrid scenes, she said, in this convent, that I want somebody near me constantly, and I must always have a light burning in my room. I cannot tell you, she added, what things I remember. They would frighten you too much. What you have seen are nothing to them. Many a murder have I witnessed. Many a nice young creature has been killed in this nunnery. I advise you to be very cautious. Keep everything to yourself. There are many here ready to betray you. What it was that I induced the old nun to express so much kindness to me I could not tell, unless she was frightened at the recollection of her own crimes and those of others, and felt grateful for the care I took of her. She had been one of the night watches, and never before showed me any particular kindness. She did not indeed go into detail concerning the transactions to which she alluded, but told me that some nuns had been murdered under great aggravations of cruelty, being gagged and left to starve in the cells, or having their flesh burned off their bones with red-hot irons. It was uncommon to find compunction expressed by any of the nuns. Habit renders us insensible to the sufferings of others and careless about our own sins. I had become so hardened myself that I find it difficult to rid myself of many of my former false principles and views of right and wrong. I was one day set to wash some empty bottles from the cellar which had contained liquid that was poured into the cemetery there. A number of these had been brought from the corner where so many of them were always to be seen, and placed at the head of the cellar stairs, and there we were required to take them and wash them out. We poured in water and rinsed them. A few drops which got upon our clothes soon made holes in them. I think the liquid was called vitriol, Vitriol, or some other name, and I heard some persons say that it would destroy the flesh and even the bones of the dead. At another time we were furnished with a little of the liquid, which was mixed with a quantity of water and used in dyeing some cloth black, which was wanted at funerals in the chapel. Our hands were turned very black by being dipped in it, but a few drops of some other liquid were mixed with fresh water and given us to wash in, which left our skin of a bright red. The bottles of which I spoke were made of very thick, dark-colored glass, large at the bottom, and I should say held something less than a gallon. I was once much shocked on entering the room for the examination of conscience at seeing a nun hanging by a cord from a ring in the ceiling, with her head downward. Her clothes had been tied around with a leathern strap to keep them in place, and then she had been fastened in that situation with her head some distance from the floor. Her face had a very unpleasant appearance, being dark-colored and swollen by the rushing in of the blood. Her hands were tied and her mouth stopped with a large gag. This nun proved to be no other than Jane Grey, who for some fault had been condemned to this punishment. This was not, however, a solitary case. I heard of numbers who were hung, as it was called, at different times, and I saw Saint Hippolyte and Saint Luke undergoing it. This was considered a most distressing punishment, and it was the only one which Jane Grey could not endure of all she had tried. Some of the nuns would allude to it in her presence, but it usually made her angry. It was probably practiced in the same place while I was a novice, I never heard or thought of such a thing in those days. Whenever we wished to enter the room for the examination of conscience, we had to ask leave, and after some delay were permitted to go, but always under a strict charge to bend the head forward and keep the eyes fixated upon the floor. That is insane. Chapter 18. More visits to the imprisoned nuns, their fears, others temporarily put into the cells, relics, Angus D, the priest's private hospital or holy retreat, secret rooms in the eastern wing, reports of murder in the convent, superior's private records, number of nuns in the convent, desire of escape, urgent reason for it, plan, deliberation, attempt, success. I often seized an opportunity when I safely could to speak a cheering or friendly word to one of the poor prisoners in passing their cells on my errands in the cellar. For a time I supposed them to be sisters, but I afterwards discovered that this was not the case. I found that they were always under the fear of suffering some punishment in case they should be found talking with a person not commissioned to attend them. They would often ask, "Is not somebody coming?" I could easily believe what I heard affirmed by others, that fear was the severest of their sufferings. Confined in the dark in so gloomy a place, with the long arched cellar stretching off this way and that, visited only now and then by a solitary nun with whom they were afraid to speak their feelings, and with only the miserable society of each other, how gloomy thus to spend day after day, month, and even years, without any prospect of liberation, and liable at any moment to another fate to which the bishop or superior might condemn them. These poor creatures must have known something of the horrors perpetuated in other parts of the building, and could not have been ignorant of the hole in the cellar, which was not far from their cells, and the use to which it was devoted. One of them told me in confidence she wished they could get out. They must also have been often disturbed in their sleep, if they ever did sleep, by the numerous priests who passed through the trap door at no great distance. To be subject to such trials for a single day would be dreadful, but these nuns had them to endure for years. I often felt much compassion for them. Wait a minute, I thought up here she said they weren't nuns. Was that, did I misread that? She says, for a time I supposed them to be sisters, but I afterwards discovered this was not the case. That's what she said there. Let's see. I'm sorry, I had to go back because it was like, wait a minute, I thought she said they weren't sisters. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. Let's see. Okay. One of them told me in confidence she wished they could get out. They must also have been often disturbed in their sleep, if they ever did sleep, by the numerous priests who passed through the trap door at no great distance. To be subject to such trials for a single day would be dreadful, but these nuns had them to endure for years. I often felt much compassion for them and wished to see them released, but at other times, yielding to the doctrine perpetually taught us in the convent, that our future happiness would be proportioned to the sufferings we had to undergo in this world, I would rest satisfied that their imprisonment was a real blessing to them. Others, I presumed, participated with me in such feelings. One Sunday afternoon, after we had performed all our ceremonies and were engaged as usual at that time with backgammon and other amusements, one of the young nuns exclaimed, "Oh, how headstrong are those wretches in the cell! They are so bad as the day they were put in." This explanation was made, as I supposed, in consequence of some recent conversation with them, as I knew her to be particularly acquainted with the older one. Some of the vacant cells were occasionally used for temporary imprisonment. 3 nuns were confined in them, to my knowledge, for disobedience to the superior, as she called it. They did not join the rest in singing in the evening, being exhausted in the various exertions of the day. The superior ordered them to sing, as they did not comply. After the command had been twice repeated, she ordered them away to the cells. They were immediately taken down into the cellar, placed in separate dungeons, and the doors shut and barred upon them. There they remained through the night, following day, and second night, but were released in time to attend mass on the second morning. The superior used occasionally to show something in a glass box, which we were required to regard with the highest degree of reverence. It was made of wax and called an Angus D, Lamb of God. She used to exhibit it to us when we were in a state of grace, that is, after confession and before sacrament. She said it had been blessed in the very dish in which our Savior had eaten. It was brought from Rome. Every time we kissed it or even looked at it, we were told it gave 100 days' release from purgatory to ourselves, or if we did not need it, to our next of kin in purgatory, if not a Protestant. That's so stupid. If we had no such kinsman, and benefit was to go to the souls in purgatory not prayed for. Jane Ray would sometimes say to me, "Let's kiss it. My friends will thank us for it." I have been repeatedly employed in carrying dainties of different kinds into the little private room I have mentioned, next, beyond the superior sitting room, in the second story, which the priests made their holy retreat. That room I never was allowed to enter. I could only go to the door with a waiter of refreshments, set it down upon a little stand near it, give 3 raps on the door, and then retire to a distant distance to wait orders. When anything was to be taken away, it was placed on the stand by the superior, who then gave 3 raps for me and closed the door. The bishop I saw at least once when he appeared worse for wine or something of the kind. After partaking of refreshments in the convent, he sent for all the nuns, and on our appearance gave us his blessing, and put a piece of pound cake on the shoulder of each of us in a manner which appeared singular and foolish. There are 3 rooms in the Black Nunnery which I never entered. I had enjoyed such liberty, and had seen, as I supposed, all parts of the building, when one day I observed an old nun go to a corner of an apartment near the northern end of the western wing, push the end of her scissors into a crack in the panel wall, and pull out a door. I was much surprised, because I never had conjectured that any door was there, and it appeared, when I afterwards examined the place, that no indication of it could be discovered on the closest scrutiny. I stepped forward to see what was within, and saw 3 rooms opening into each other, but the nun refused to admit me within the door, which she said led to rooms kept as depositories. She herself entered and closed the door, so that I could not satisfy my curiosity, and no occasion presented itself. I always had a strong desire to know the use of these apartments, for I am sure they must have been designed for some purpose of which I was intentionally kept ignorant. Otherwise, they never would have remained unknown to me so long. Besides, the old nun evidently had some strong reason for denying me admission, though she endeavored to quiet my curiosity. The superior, after my admission into the convent, had told me I had access to every room in the building, and I had seen places which bore witness to the cruelties and the crimes committed under her commands or sanction. But here was a succession of rooms which had been concealed from me, and so constructed as if designed to be unknown to all but a few. I am sure that any person who might be able to examine the wall in that place would pronounce that secret door a surprising piece of work. I never saw anything of the kind which appeared to me so ingenious and skilfully made. I told Jane Ray what I had seen, and she said at once, "We will get in and see what is in there." But I suppose she never found an opportunity. I naturally felt a good deal of curiosity to learn whether such scenes as I had witnessed in the death of St. Francis were common or rare, and took an opportunity to inquire of Jane Ray. Her reply was, "Oh, yes, there were many murdered while you were a novice, whom you heard nothing about." This was all I ever learnt on the subject. Although I was told nothing of the manner in which they were killed, I supposed it to be the same which I had seen practised, namely, by smothering. I went into Superior's parlor one day for something, and found Jane Ray there alone, looking into a book with an appearance of interest. I asked her what it was, but she made some trifling answer, and laid it by as if unwilling to let me take it. There are 2 bookcases in the room, one on the right as you enter the door, the other opposite near the window on the sofa. The former contains the lecture books of other printed volumes. The latter seem to be filled with notes and account books. I have often seen the keys in the bookcases while I have been dusting the furniture, and sometimes observed letters stuck out in the room, although I never looked into one or thought of doing so. We were under strict orders not to touch any of them, and the idea of sins and penances was always present in my mind. Some time after the occasion, I mentioned I was sent into the superior's room with Jane to arrange it, and as the same book was lying out of the case, she said, "Come, let us look into it." I immediately consented, and we opened it and turned over several leaves. It was about a foot and a half long, as nearly as I can remember, a foot wide, and about 2 inches thick. Though I cannot speak with particular precision, as Jane frightened me almost as soon as I touched it by exclaiming, "There, you have looked into it. If you tell of me, I will of you." The thought of being subjected to a severe penance, which I had reason to apprehend, fluttered me very much. And although I tried to cover my fears, I did not succeed very well. I reflected, however, that the sin was already committed, and that it would not increase if I examined the book. I therefore looked a little at several pages, though I still felt a good deal of agitation. I saw at once that the volume was a record of the entrance of nuns and novices into the convent, and of the births that had taken place in the convent. Entries of the last description were made in a brief manner on the following plan. I do not give the names or dates as real, only to show the form of entering them. Saint Mary delivered a son, March 16th, 1834. Saint Clare delivered a daughter, April 2nd. Saint Matilda delivered a daughter, April 30th, etc. No mention was made in the book of the death of the children, though I well knew not one of them could be living at that time. Now I presume that the period the book embraced was about 2 years, and several names near the beginning I knew. But can form only a rough conjecture of the number of infants born and murdered, of course, records of which it contained. I suppose the book contained at least 100 pages, and one-fourth were written upon. Each page contained 15 distinct records. Several pages were devoted to the list of births. On this supposition, there must have been a large number that I can easily believe to have been born there in the course of 2 years. What were the contents of the other books belonging to the same case, I have no idea, having never dared to touch one of them. I believe, however, Jane Ray was well acquainted with them, knowing as I do her intelligence and prying disposition. If she could be brought to give her testimony, she would doubtless unfold many curious particulars now unknown. I am able, in consequence of a circumstance which appeared accidental, to state with confidence the exact number of persons in the convent one day of the week in which I left it. This may be a point of some interest, as several deaths have occurred since my taking the veil, and many burials have been openly made in the chapel. I was appointed at the time mentioned to lay out the covers of all the inmates of the convent, including the nuns in the cells. These covers, as I have said before, were linen bands to be bound around the knives, forks, spoons, and napkins for eating. These were all for the nuns and novices, and amounted to 210. The number of novices was then about 30. I know that there must have been at that time about 180 veiled nuns. I was occasionally troubled with the desire of escaping from the nunnery, and was much distressed whenever I felt so evil an imagination rise in my mind. I believed that it was a sin, a great sin, and did not fail to confess at every opportunity that I felt discontented. My confessor informed me that I was beset with evil spirits, and urged me to pray against them. Still, however, every now and then I would think, "Oh, if I could get out." At length, one of the priests to whom I had confessed the sin informed me, for my comfort, that he had begun to pray to Saint Anthony, and hoped his intercession would, by and by, drive away the evil spirit. My desire of escape was partly excited by the fear of bringing an infant to the murderous hands of my companions, or of taking a potion whose violent effects I too well knew. One evening, however, I found myself more filled with the desire of escaping than ever, and what exertions I made to dismiss the thought proved entirely unavailing. During evening prayers I began quite occupied with it, and when the time of meditation arrived, instead of falling into a doze, as I often did, though I was a good deal fatigued, I found no difficulty in keeping awake. When this exercise was over and the other nuns were about to retire to the sleeping room, my station being in the private sick room for the night, I withdrew to my post, which was the little sitting room adjoining it. Here, then, I threw myself upon the sofa, and being alone, reflected a few moments on the manner of escaping which had occurred to me. The physician had arrived a little before at 8:30, and I had now to accompany him, as usual, from bed to bed, with pen, ink, and paper to write down his prescriptions or the directions of the old nun who was to see them administered. What I wrote on that evening I cannot now recollect, as my mind was uncommonly agitated. My customary way was to note down briefly his orders in this manner: 1. B. Salts Saint Mathilde. 1. Blister Saint Genevieve, etc. I remember that I wrote these orders that evening, and then, having finished the rounds, I returned for a few moments to the sitting room. There was two ways of access to the street from these rooms. First, the more direct, from the passage joining the sick room downstairs through a door into the nunnery yard and through a wicker gate. This is the way by which the physician usually enters at night, and he is provided with a key for that purpose. It would have been unsafe, however, for me to pass out that way, because a man is kept continually in the yard near the gate, who sleeps at night in a small hut near the door, to escape whose observation would be impossible. My only hope, therefore, was that I might gain my passage through the other way, to do which I must pass through the sick room, and through a passage, a small room usually occupied by an old nun, another passage and staircase leading down to the yard, and a large gate opening into the cross street. I had no liberty to go beyond the sick room, and knew that several of the doors might be fastened. Still I determined to try. Although I have often since been astonished at my boldness in undertaking what exposed me to so many hazards of failure and severe punishment, I have found out. It seemed as if I acted under some extraordinary impulse which encouraged me to what I should hardly at any other moment have thought of undertaking. I had sat but a short time upon the sofa. However, before I rose, with a desperate determination to make the experiment, I walked hastily across the sick room, passed into the nun's room, walked by her in a great hurry, and almost without giving her time to speak or think, said, "A message," and in an instant was through the door and in the next passage. I think there was another nun with her at that moment, and it is probable that my hurried manner and prompt intimation that I was sent on a pressing mission to the superior prevented them from entertaining any suspicion of my intention. Besides, I had the written orders of the physician in my hand, which may have tended to mislead them, and it was well known to some of the nuns that I had twice left the convent and returned from choice, so that I was probably more likely to be trusted to remain than many of the others. The passage which I now reached had several doors, with all of which I was acquainted, and on the opposite side opened into a community room, where I should have probably found some of the old nuns at that hour, and they would certainly have stopped me. On the left, however, was a large door, both locked and barred, but I gave the door a sudden swing, that it might creak as little as possible, being of iron. On the stairs I hurried, and making my way through the door into the yard, stepped across it, unbarred the great gate, and was at liberty. Conclusion. The following circumstances comprise all that is deemed necessary now to subjoin the preceding narrative. After my arrival in New York, I was introduced to the almshouse, where I was attended with kindness and care, and, as I hoped, was entirely unknown. But when I had been some time in that institution, I found that it was reported that I was a fugitive nun, and not long after an Irish woman belonging to the house brought me a secret message which caused me such agitation. I was sitting in the room of Mrs. Johnson, the matron, engaged in sewing, when the Irish woman employed in the institution came and told me that Mr. Conroy was below, and had sent to see me. I was informed that he was a Roman priest who often visited the house, and he had a particular wish to see me at that time, having come, as I believe, expressly for that purpose. I showed unwillingness to comply with such an invitation, and did not go. The woman told me further that he sent me word that I need not think to avoid him, for it would be impossible for me to do so. I might conceal myself as well as I could, but I should be found and taken, that no matter where I went, or what hiding place I might choose, I should be known, and I had better come at once. He knew who I was, and he was authorized to take me to the Sisters of Charity if I should prefer to join them. He would promise that I might stay with them if I chose and be permitted to remain in New York. He sent me word further that he received full power and authority over me from the superior of the Hotel du Nunnery at Montreal, and was able to do all that she could do as her right to dispose of me at her will, and had been imparted to him by a regular writing received from Canada. This was alarming information for me, the weakness in which I was at that time. The woman added that the same authority had been given to all the priests, so that, go where I might, I should meet men informed about me and my escape, fully empowered to seize me whenever they could, and convey me back to the convent from which I had escaped. Under these circumstances, it seemed to me that they offered to place me among the Sisters of Charity with permission to remain in New York with mild and favorable. However, I had resolution enough to refuse to see Priest Conroy. Not long afterwards, I was informed by the same messenger that the priest was again in the building and repeated his request. I desired one of the gentlemen connected with the institution that a stop might be put to such messages, as I wished to receive no more of them. A short time after, however, the woman told me that Mr. Conroy wished to inquire of me whether my name was not Saint Eustace while a nun, and if I had not confessed to Priest Kelly in Montreal. I answered that it was all true, for I had confessed to him a short time while in the nunnery. I was then told again that the priest wanted to see me, and I sent back word that I would see him in the presence of Mr. B or Mr. S, which, however, was not agreed to. And I was afterwards informed that Mr. Conroy, the Roman priest, spent an hour in the room, in a passage where I had frequently been, but through the mercy of God I was employed at another place at that time, and had no occasion to go where I should have met him. I afterwards repeatedly heard that Mr. Conroy continued to visit the house and to ask for me, but I never saw him. I once had determined to leave the institution and to go to the Sisters of Charity, but circumstances occurred which gave me time for further reflection, and I was saved from the destruction to which I should have been exposed. As the period of my I don't know what that word accouchement accouchement approached, sometimes thought that I should not survive it, and then the recollection of the dreadful crimes I had witnessed in the nunnery would come upon me very powerfully, and I would think it a solemn duty to disclose them before I die. To have knowledge of those things and leave the world without making them known appeared to me like a great sin, whenever I could divest myself of the impression made upon me by the declarations and arguments of the superior, nuns, and priests of the duty of submitting to everything, necessary holiness of whatever they did or required. On the second evening before the period which I anticipated with so much anxiety, I was sitting alone and began to indulge in reflections of this kind. It seemed to me that I must be near the close of my life, and I determined to make a disclosure at once. I spoke to Mrs. Ford, a woman whose character I respected, a nurse in the hospital, number 23. I informed her that I had no expectation of living long, and I had some things in my mind which I wished to communicate before it should be too late. I added that I should prefer telling them to Mr. P. chaplain, of which she approved, as she considered it a duty to do so under those circumstances. I had no opportunity, however, to converse with Mr. T that time, and probably my purpose of disclosing the facts already given in this book would never have been executed but for what subsequently took place. It was alarm which led me to form such a determination, and when the period of trial had been safely passed, I had a prospect of recovery. Anything appeared to be more unlikely than that I should make this exposure. I was then a Roman Catholic, at least a great part of my time. My conduct, in a great measure, was according to the faith and motives of a Roman Catholic. Notwithstanding what I knew of the conduct of so many of the priests and nuns, I thought that it had no effect on the sanctity of the church or the authority or effects of the acts performed by the former at the Mass, confession, etc. I had such a regard for my vows as a nun that I considered my hand as well as my heart irrevocably given to Jesus Christ, and could never have allowed any person to take it. Indeed, to this day I feel an instinctive aversion to offering my hand or taking the hand of another person, even as an expression of friendship. I also thought that I might soon return to the Catholics, although fear and disgust held me back. I had now that infant to think for, whose life I had happily saved by my timely escape. I get it. See, it took me a minute. You all probably already got it as I was reading. She was pregnant. She was pregnant. Oh my goodness. Even as an expression of friendship. Okay. I also thought that I might soon return to the Catholics, although fear and disgust held me back. I had now that infant to think for, whose life I had happily saved by my timely escape from the nunnery. What its fate might be, in case it should ever fall into the power of the priest, I could not tell. I had, however, reason for alarm. With a child destined to destruction, like the infants I had seen baptized and smothered, be allowed to go through the world unmolested, a living memorial of the truth of crimes long practiced in security, because never exposed. What pledges could I get to satisfy me that I, on whom its dependence must be, would be spared by those who, I had reason to think, were wishing them then to sacrifice me? How could I trust the helpless infant in hands which had hastened the baptism of many such in order to hurry them into the secret pit in the cellar? I suppose that Father Filon, priest of the parish church of Montreal, would see his own child growing up in the world and feel willing to run the risk of having the truth exposed. What could I expect, especially from him, but the utmost rancor and the most determined enmity against the innocent child and its abused and defenseless mother? Yet my mind would sometimes still incline to the opposite direction, and indulge the thought that perhaps the only way to secure heaven to us both was to throw ourselves back into the hands of the Church to be treated as she pleased. When, therefore, the fear of immediate death was removed, I renounced all thoughts of communicating with the substance of the facts of this volume. It happened, however, that my danger was not past. I was soon seized with very alarming symptoms, when my desire to disclose my story revived. I had before had an opportunity to speak in private with the chaplain, but as it was at a time when I supposed myself out of danger, I had deferred for 3 days my proposal communication, thinking that I might yet avoid it altogether. When my symptoms, however, became more alarming, I was anxious for Saturday to arrive, the day which I had appointed, and when I had not the opportunity on that day which I desired, I thought it might be too late. I did not see him till Monday, when my prospects of surviving were very gloomy, and I then informed him that I wished to communicate to him a few secrets which were likely otherwise to die with me. I then told him that while a nun in the convent of Montreal, I had witnessed the murder of a nun called St. Francis, and of at least one of the infants which I have spoken of in this book. I added some few circumstances, and I believe disclosed in general terms some of the crimes I knew of in that nunnery. My anticipation of death proved to be unfounded. My health afterwards improved, and had I not made the confessions on that occasion, it is very possible I might never have made them. I, however, afterwards felt more willing to listen to instruction and express friendly attentions from some of the benevolent persons around me, who, taking an interest in me on account of my darkened understanding, were ever ready to counsel me when I desired it. I soon began to believe that God might have intended that his creatures should learn his will by his work, taking upon them the free exercise of their reason and acting under responsibility to him. It is very difficult for one who has never given way to such arguments and influences as those to which I had been exposed, to realize how hard it is to think aright after thinking wrong. I realize in some degree how it is that the people of the United States are so strongly opposed to such doctrines as are taught in the Black and Congregational nunneries of Montreal. The priests and nuns used often to declare that Of all heretics, the children from the United States were the most difficult to be converted. And it was thought a great triumph when one of them was brought over to the truth faith. And then I'm going to stop it there, but we're going to pick up maybe hopefully tomorrow. Well, it's only 8:18. Maybe I'll finish this tonight. We'll finish this tonight, but not in this recording. We'll record another one, but it's the extracts from public journals relating to the truth of Mary Monk's disclosures. So these are documented records that we're going to read next. All right. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. Embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your heart, my heart, so we will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all. Bye bye.